When I was a new bride, a dear family friend taught me to make this delicious dish. It was so easy and always popular. To make beef stroganoff, you'll need 1 to 2 pounds of a good quality beef. I'm using top sirloin, 1/2 of a chopped onion, a small scallion, as many mushrooms as you want. There's no proportions here. About a tablespoon of tomato paste, 1.5 cups of chicken broth, or it can be bouillon or beef broth or whatever you have. I'm going to be adding wine to my stroganoff, although wine is optional. You'll need flour, salt, pepper. I'm going to be using herbs of Provence and some butter to saute my vegetables in. I'll also be serving it over extra wide old-fashioned noodles and finishing it with creme fraiche and garden fresh herbs. You start this dish by taking your beef and cutting it into strips or chunks, whichever you prefer. A little trick and a little tip is that if you slice your beef while it's still just slightly frozen, it's much easier to manage. So the first step here is I'm going to dry and blot my beef. You really want any meat, chicken, anything that you're working with when you're going to brown it to be dry, because it won't brown if it's too wet. So once it's dried, and this feels pretty good, I'm going to transfer it back into the bowl and add my seasonings. My seasonings will be herbs of Provence, salt, and pepper at this point. So I'm adding my salt in generous pinches, my herbs of Provence. No proportions here, just whatever seems right and to your taste, the pepper, and then toss it with your hands. And I can tell I'm going to need a little bit more salt. I'm going to go ahead and use the rest of the pepper, and I think I'll put the rest of the herbs of Provence in there as well. Just toss it around gently with your fingers, and the next step is it's going to go into a hot pan where my oil has been heating, and we'll brown it. Our beef is browning beautifully, and I'm just grating a clove of garlic into this mixture, and I wish you could smell how delicious it smells. My meat is beautifully browned, and now I'm taking it off the heat and putting it back into a bowl. I'm going to add a little bit of butter to this pan with all the drippings from the meat, and then we'll saute our onions and mushrooms. Turn the heat back on. Once your butter has melted, dump in your onions, shallot, and mushrooms. Stir them around. The mushrooms will give off a lot of moisture at this point, so you don't have to worry too much about any other addition. And this will probably take about 2 or 3 minutes until your onions are translucent and tender and your mushrooms start to look as though they're cooked. So our mushrooms and onions look beautiful, absolutely beautiful. I wish you could smell them. Now it's time to add the beef back into the pot. I'm going to be doing this stroganoff today on top of the stove, but stroganoff works really well in a crock pot or in an electric skillet if you're fortunate enough to have one, or even in the oven. So once your meat is mixed in with your mushrooms, it's time to add the flour. And sprinkle about 2 tablespoons of flour over your meat. This is going to be your thickening, and we're going to add the liquid next. So you want to cook this for about 2 minutes to cook the flour taste out of the flour. One of the things I learned in France is never to add flour unless you can cook it for at least 2 minutes, or you'll get a really nasty flour taste to your gravy or whatever you're working with. So while that finishes cooking, I'm going to gather my liquids. Okay, my first addition is going to be 1.5 cups of chicken broth. I mentioned before, I always use chicken broth. And my next addition is going to be about, about a half a cup of red wine. And the red wine is optional. If you don't want to add it, that's perfectly fine. Truth be known, my original recipe did not call for wine, but I think it's a nice addition. Our pot is coming to a boil, so now it's time to add about a tablespoon, a generous tablespoon of tomato paste. Stir it in, get it all blended. The tomato paste is kind of the secret ingredient that my friend taught me about all those years ago, and it makes it just a little bit different than some of the stroganoff recipes that you'll see. And I like the color it adds, and I like the flavor and the acidity that it adds to the dish, as well as just a little touch of sweetness. And now we're going to finish this off. I'm going to add some fresh oregano and some fresh marjoram. Marjoram is a sweeter, milder oregano, but they are related, and we have a lot of this in our herb garden, so I like to use it whenever I can. And if you look into my pot, you can see it's starting to thicken beautifully. And now I'm going to reduce the heat, and it's going to cook for, I'm going to check it in an hour. I checked my beautiful stroganoff after 1 hour, and I realized it needed a little bit longer to cook. Even though I had used a top sirloin, the meat was still not tender enough. One of the things that's the beauty of this particular recipe is that you can cook it for the first hour and finish the cooking closer to your mealtime. So I let it sit on the stove off heat all afternoon and then turned the heat back on about an hour and a half ago. So the total cooking time was about 2.5 hours for this particular stroganoff. Now just before serving, I'm ready to finish it off with creme fraiche. This is about 4 ounces of creme fraiche that's stirred into the stroganoff. Stroganoff actually is named after a Russian count. The legend has it that he was born in Paris and hired a French chef to come and cook for his family and asked him to come up with something that was kind of Russian with a French flair. And the chef came up with what became known as beef stroganoff, named after the family in the mid-1900s. So now that with our creme fraiche added, and we know that it won't curdle, because creme fraiche won't curdle, I'm going to reheat it and plate it over noodles.